Hey everyone, Sam and Chris from Wyvern Kodiak here. Before we get started, like and subscribe, check out some of the other videos and content that we have on our channels. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for pressing play and joining me at the Wyvern Kodiak channel. This is Chris, and I'll be flying solo today. Sam's out doing what Sam does, and he's being far too generous and probably buying a lot of Christmas presents. Before we get started talking about knives today, from the bottom of my heart, I just wanted to thank you very much for just the community and the growth that we're having. Every single one of you that are listening right now, those of you who press like, those of you who comment, you absolutely make our day. This community has introduced us to so many wonderful people that we now call friends, and it certainly isn't easy for grown men to go find new friends. So thank you very much. Now, this simply isn't going to be a knife review today. It's going to be about timing and uncertainty and how men often find themselves quietly through tools and life circumstances. It's going to take a few minutes for me to get there, but I do think that the lead up matters. So, give me just a few moments here of playing with the knife and explaining some things. When I watch knife reviewers, I often walk away feeling like I need to go buy whatever knife it is that they had just shown. That somehow whatever knife they have in their hand has some sort of fleeting magic, and if I don't respond to it and go purchase it immediately, I'm going to be regretful forever. And Sam and I both struggle with fear of missing out. We've been pretty open with that kind of marketing doesn't leave us feeling good. So we've never explicitly talked about it, but I think that's why we try to answer a different question on our channel. Not why do you need to buy the knife that we're talking about, but who might this knife be for if you're already looking. We're not trying to create urgency. What we're trying to do is to provide some clarity. We're touching the knife. We are getting a good look at it, being able to look at the manufacturing and the fit and finish and have it up close, feel the action in our hand. And so, we're trying to provide clarity for the user and be able to determine if this is for you or not before making a purchase and potentially getting the wrong thing in the mail and being pretty unhappy with the purchase that you made and potentially regretful. Well, like knife reviewers, I've noticed some similar things when listening to prepping content as well. Except they don't try to manipulate you, or I guess manipulate's a hard word. They don't try to spur you to action based upon excitement, but they use fear. And that's the fear of being unprepared, the fear of not having what you want, and when things go to change, or maybe not having enough of those things, because they say things like 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And I'm not saying I disagree with them. I'm just saying that that's a very motivating factor, or at least it has been for me in the past. And that fear isn't irrational. I think that's human. In the video that I did that I titled "Why Am I a Knife Guy?", I announced something pretty simple. I love being prepared. My dad used to say when I was a child, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And as a protector and a provider for my family, I certainly carry that mindset deeply. It just means a lot to me to be able to eliminate or mitigate risks before they become a problem. In early 2020, as COVID began landing in America, that instinct really intensified with me. There was pressure and responsibility and the feeling that if the worst case scenario played out, that my family needed to be protected and ready. And so I prepared food, water, medical supplies, tools, redundancies, bug out plans, bug in plans, get home bags in each vehicle. And I think that preparedness absolutely helped remove some helplessness. In addition to being a knife guy, I'm also a fan of, we'll call them target sports. Prior to COVID, probably late 2018, 2019, there was about a year where every week while I was standing in line waiting for a lane assignment, I stared at what I thought was the ugliest knife that I had ever seen. And man, that was the PM2. And I thought this thing was absolutely hideous. Yeah, eventually, I asked the guy behind the counter why he would want one of these things, and he pulled his out of his pocket and he spidey flicked it open, and then he handed it to me, and told me it was the greatest knife that he had ever owned. And so once it hit my hand, my opinion instantly changed. The ergonomics and the way that it fit in my hand felt so amazing, and and then the familiarity to it, really started to connect with me, and it didn't look so terrible any longer. And so I went home and I ordered a PM2, and I officially had my first high quality knife. My very first super steel. You see the S110V there. I was able to, for the very first time with any of my knives, be able to open and close reliably one-handed. And for me, that two-handed boomer grip was gone forever. It was now dead to me. Now, COVID changed how many of us made decisions. And for me, I panic purchased not just knives, but a variety of supplies, because people were hoarding toilet paper and rubbing alcohol and hand sanitizer, canned goods, lots of things. I'm sure many of you recall, and because the manufacturing and trade and availability of items, things suddenly felt fragile. So as I saw stores were not beginning to replenish shelves, and at the speed that I had been accustomed to my entire life, my identity as a provider and a protector were starting to be challenged. And in that headspace, I wanted some redundancy for my one and only very nice knife, and because one is none. So I wanted to get something that was engineered well enough to outlast the uncertainty that I was feeling. And I did a quick Google search, and best pocket knives was what I was searching for, and the same name kept popping up on every single list, and that was the Norseman. And I watched a video on it, and my first reaction, hideous. And my second reaction was, what? It is interesting. And I decided to trust the data more than my instinct due to my experience with the PM2. But the Norseman was far out of my price range. And so I hopped on eBay and I looked for a used one, and I found one for about a third of the cost, and it said it was brand new. So, I immediately bought it because, this was a season where cash mattered more than caution. And I felt the decline in the availability of goods may have motivated somebody to price that thing to sell, just in order to be able to get their hands on some funds immediately. Well, what arrived at my home wasn't a counterfeit, but it was a clone. I knew as soon as I picked it up and touched it that this was not right, and because I'd done a lot of research on the Norseman while it was in transit, and knew right away that this was not accurate. I hopped on the post and I saw that the person did divulge that information, so they weren't trying to get over on me, but I just didn't read carefully enough. So I will say it feels like it's high quality, it feels like it functions, but yet right from the get-go, it just felt wrong. Owning this clone feels like I'm holding some stolen goods, and not because of legality, but because, whoever crafted this, they benefited from somebody else's intent and effort and risk without carrying any of the weight for any of it on their own. And even if it does work, it just lacks legitimacy. And, I can, feel that absence in the few times that I've handled it since purchasing it. And, there was about a 2 or 3 year span where I completely forgot, where I put this. I shoved it down in a bag someplace and forgot about it. But I will say, once I did receive this and then I felt the ergos and the size of it in my hands, it did do one thing for me perfectly. It made me want the real Norseman even more. But family, family needs and some uncertainty at the time certainly delayed my purchase, but the Norseman became my grail. Now, 5 years went by from in between the time that I received my clone and the time that we went through Atlanta in 2025, where I was certain that I was going to go buy a Norseman. Unfortunately, the knives did not show up. Or for the Grimsmos, their entire stock that they planned to bring got caught up in shipping someplace and never made it to their table. But I made that decision to purchase those because in that 5-year period, I had watched dozens of videos from the Grimsmos, and not marketing videos. I watched manufacturing videos. I watched their design challenges, their iterations, their failures, their refinement. They certainly reshaped how I view design and how difficult resisting being good enough is. There are so many times that through their videos they're so close, but it's not what they're looking for. And so they just choose to move forward with refinement as opposed to getting it out the door, and I certainly applaud that. One of the things that it really drove home with me is that when your standard is excellence, putting something in the world that's merely good enough is absolutely failure. And I believe that refinement matters way more than novelty does, and that's something, an attitude that Sam and I are going to be carrying as we release knives. I think personally carrying things with high standards also pushes me to keep high standards, and that's one of the reasons why I like to put together myself with quality tools, whether it's knives, pins, etc. Things that you're going to remind me of excellence as I'm moving throughout my day. I want to introduce a couple of different ideas here. The Norseman, I think, is in a different league than many other knives. As we talked about, there are tools. I mean, you can hear that. It's an okay flak. It's better on the clothes because I can put a lot more behind that heavy blade. But I use this to pick staples out of wood and cut boxes open when something comes in, and that's about it. It does nothing for me more than just the utility of being a cutting instrument. But then I think you level up to a machine. That's the tool, plus a good quality experience of how it makes you feel in the hand. It's got mechanical excellence. It's got mechanical soul, like this Devo Stout here. Shout out to Lefty and Colin, the guys at Devo. They've just put out some amazing designs, and this is probably my favorite one of all the ones that they put out so far. Probably own 5 or 6 of them, and that one's my favorite. But I think the Norseman elevates things to a different class, and just like the machine has all the qualities of the tool plus, I think the instrument is the highest level. And I think that's certainly what the Norseman is. An instrument doesn't just function. An instrument doesn't just cut when you apply force. And if I grab a piece of paper, I'm not going to slice this paper. I'm just going to put on it and push down, and cleanly just going right through it. You expect that out of knives, so that doesn't make it an instrument alone. But it communicates through resistance and sound and balance and movement. It rewards control, and it exposes carelessness, and it reflects intentional design. What the Norseman is an instrument. And I want to be clear, an instrument doesn't have to be expensive. It isn't about cost. It's about engineering and execution. And I look at something like the Vosteed Porcupine, less than $70, and I absolutely think this thing is an instrument. As I failed it there, this thing opens and closes for me wonderfully most of the time. Certainly feels in my hand amazing. It's got the things I like on the spec sheet, with jimping in the right places, but also additional texture. This knife to me is an absolute instrument. At the same time, I think this QSP Penguin is too. We get the same situation. It's not an expensive knife, but man, that thing feels absolutely amazing on these washers, and it flies out there, and it's just put together exceptionally well. Now, a knife has mechanical soul when it engages multiple senses, with positivity and intentionality. It communicates confidence, control, and purpose through its design and execution, and I think the Norseman does just that. It feels engineered and not just assembled. Every single part on this feels absolutely intentional, and this feels substantial but not excessive. It's predictable, it's intentional, it's refined. Like, I cannot fail this. I've over 1,000 times I've opened this thing, and sure, I've had my fingers slide off for the thumb stud or the flipper, but if I break detent, I cannot help but for that thing to open, even when I'm not pushing it hard. It just is so well tuned. It's so predictable. If it breaks detent, it's opening, and you know that, and it locks up with an amazing sound. And when it closes, same way. It's got a very distinctive sound that I know exactly where it is, without even, without seeing it. I can open it, close it, and trust that it's, the blade's where I want it to be. Before I start taking action, I don't have to stop and look at it. Now, this doesn't make me feel like a more capable cutter, but it does make me feel accomplished. It makes me feel grateful. It makes me feel confident. And that pride isn't vanity. It's gratitude for access, to having a knife like this, for patience of being able to put in the sacrifice and save and do the things to be able to get it, and for the growth that I've had through the process of getting it. And I worked, I made sacrifices, I persisted, and I succeeded with what I set out to do. Now, I think men feel often, but we just don't talk about our feelings much. And I think pride, gratitude, confidence, responsibility, vulnerability are all things that we could openly talk about, and it's something I feel that we all share, and it's just on a spectrum of how much we feel each of those things. And I just feel grateful being able to share with you how I feel about my tools, and I think these instruments that we have, they certainly mirror who we are and who we're trying to become. I think they reinforce, those things. And while this channel is certainly about knives for knife guys, I think it's also about understanding why we're drawn to them, and how these feelings can be intentional, ways for us to pursue growth, discipline, and purpose. The Norseman itself wasn't my very first grail because of its specs. It was my grail because of what it confirms, and that's the mechanical soul. And so I want to wrap things up right now and ask you a few questions. So I'm starting to get a little long-winded here, but have you ever grown to love a knife that you originally thought was ugly? Or is the knife that you have that's your most expensive one the most trusted one? Or are those two things one and the same? Have you ever handled a knife that felt engineered and not just assembled? What does mechanical soul mean to you? Even if that's hard to define, because we could argue what shade of green this is, or the what's better, a thumb stud or a flipper. But what we can't do is argue how something makes you feel or how something makes me feel. And I think that's what mechanical soul is it's a feeling that's tied deeply to you. Um, and I think, what's one knife that you waited way too long to buy, or maybe that you bought way too fast because you didn't have the answers? And then finally, if I didn't ask the question that you want to answer, let's hear from you in the comments. And so Sam and I love learning about you in the comments and from growing from your information and walking life out with you. So I look forward to chatting with you very soon. Thank you, friends.